Welcome, everyone, to the American Enterprise Institute and to tonight's event on the War on Science. I'm Tony Mills. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI and director of our Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. Before I introduce Dr. Lawrence Krauss, who will then introduce the panel that will be the central feature of tonight's event, I thought I'd say a few words about the topic of tonight's event and why we're here, and in particular, the role that this new book plays in engaging with it. As everyone here knows, for a long time, since at least the late 19th century, with the emergence of the modern research university, science has been a site of political conflict and contestation in our public life. At that time, and especially in the next century, a growing concern focused on the prospect of the encroachment on science by the state. In the middle of the 20th century, the scientist and philosopher Michael Polanyi gave an impassioned defense of what he called the autonomy of science, which he then identified as being under threat by Soviet communism, which sought to reduce science to a mere ideology or a mask for economic or political power. And on the basis of this, the regime then undertook a grotesque coercion and deformation of the scientific enterprise. For Polanyi, the autonomy of science was about much more than science itself. At stake was the autonomy of intellectual culture itself, something that he thought was both good in itself, but also vital for a flourishing free society. These views were widely shared in the 20th century by many American conservatives and Cold War era liberals. They have recently been rediscovered by many contemporary liberals today, given justified concerns about the current administration's aggressive efforts to exert political pressure on the scientific enterprise. But freedom from government coercion is not enough for scientific flourishing. Science is not a collection of atomistic individuals pursuing their own interests or whims. As Polanyi saw, science is a spontaneous order, an evolved tradition bound together by shared norms and a commitment to truth. The sociologist Robert Merton famously tried to classify these norms, these scientific norms. And I want to just mention two that I think are pertinent to tonight's discussion. One is what he called organized skepticism. This is the idea that scientific claims should be subjected to rational criticism by a community of peers. Another norm that he identified was what he called universalism, the idea that scientific claims should be evaluated on their merits, not on the basis of who it is that advances them. In recent years, we've seen a weakening and even in some quarters an outright rejection of these scientific norms. A tendency to dismiss arguments rather than subjecting them to critical scrutiny, to attack people rather than engaging with their arguments. Worse still, rather than upholding and defending these scientific norms, which make science flourish, too often scientific institutions have been idle or even complicit in their erosion. This poses a new and distinct kind of challenge to scientific autonomy, in some ways more insidious even than overt political control. The erosion of a vibrant intellectual culture within science and its institutions weakens scientific autonomy from within, even while the challenges from without remain and in some ways intensify. The book we're discussing tonight, The War on Science, the occasion for our gathering here, documents the erosion of these norms, of this culture, from the point of view of those who have been, or in some cases still are, so to speak, on the front lines, including those who have had reputations, careers, and characters attacked on account of the views that they hold or have publicly advanced. The link Michael Polanyi made between scientific autonomy and the free society may sound highfalutin or abstract, but the practical effects of the erosion of the scientific norms and the culture he sought to defend are everywhere in evidence in our political culture today. And the War on Science is an effort to counter these tendencies and to restore vitality to political discourse and the institutions that are meant to sustain it. The editor of the book War on Science is Dr. Lawrence Krauss, an internationally renowned theoretical physicist, best-selling author, public intellectual, acclaimed lecturer. I won't go through the entirety of his long biography. I'll just mention a few highlights. He received his PhD in physics from MIT and was a Harvard Junior Fellow before holding faculty positions at Yale and Case Western Reserve, where he chaired the physics department. From 2008 to 2018, he served as the foundation professor and inaugural director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. He has written countless papers, articles, 12 acclaimed books, and is a frequent contributor to popular publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's currently the president of the Origins Project Foundation and host of the Origins podcast, which focuses on dialogues with leading thinkers from science, the arts, politics, and journalism. And most importantly, for the purposes of tonight, he is the editor of the book, The War on Science. So I will stop talking now, and without further ado, pass it over to Dr. Krauss. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I have to stand here because there's the microphone. Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back. It's been at least, I think, 20 years since I was here before. And I thank you for the introduction about science. And it's great to be here with this panel who not only have connections to this illustrious institution, but are also co-authors of the book. Now, I want to see if this works. And good. It works in spite of the fact they don't use Macs. Anyway, I'm going to give an introduction to sort of the book in general, trying to avoid the issues that I think the panel are going to discuss, having to do with each one of those. But I want to give some perspective. So after 2 or 3 hours, we'll get to the panel. But I personally was motivated to do this, and I think many of my colleagues were, but I personally was, because many years ago when I taught at Yale, I thought science and reason were immune to the nonsense that's now happening. And of course, they weren't. And that's the key point. So one of the reasons for writing this book, and all of the authors being involved, I want to just give a perspective of that. When I was thinking about this and the issues that permeate the academic culture that are so destructive to science, reason, and scholarship, I wanted to do a few things. One, here's a lot of complaints from the outside, but I wanted to make sure that I got people from the inside who were knowledgeable about what was going on and could talk about things from their perspective as seen from the inside. The other thing I wanted to do was get a diverse group, and by diverse I mean intellectually diverse group, which I think is what matters. I wanted to get people from a wide number of disciplines, because this isn't, I'm a physicist, but it's not just physics, and I want to get a broad set of those people. But I also want to get people that spanned the political spectrum as well, because I knew the book would probably be attacked as a right-wing diatribe, and I wanted to get well-known lefties. Besides, I'm sort of have been in the past a well-known lefty, although now I'm apparently not. But you know, people like Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins as well, who have that tradition, so again, it would take away that attacking point. But the key reason to produce this is that, first of all, many people in the public aren't aware of how pervasive this is. But within academia, there are actually academics who aren't, I've talked to many colleagues who have no idea of what's going on because they keep their head down below the radar. But there are also many people who are afraid to speak out. And I figured if I could get distinguished people, academics, to speak out about this issue, it might encourage other people to speak out. And I think that's very important because, as I'll say at the end, this is going to be a long war to fight. And it's difficult because it's so ingrained. And I think one of the only ways it will end is when enough academics within the academic community finally say enough. And so I hope that by speaking out publicly, we would begin that process. And if you're not convinced that people are afraid, when I think I first wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal maybe in 2020, and I wrote an article about the ideological corruption of science, and I got a lot of letters. And I got letters from faculty from around the country, people I didn't know. They were all on personal email addresses, no one from their university email address. And at least 4 of them wrote under assumed names, because they said they didn't want their colleagues or their administrators to learn that they agreed with what I said. That is shocking. I mean, that's the antithesis of scholarship. That's like the Soviet Union or Hungary or East Berlin. And that really surprised me, and that convinced me that there was a problem. So I want to go over some of the things, and I'll try to do it fairly quickly so we can get to the important stuff, which is my colleagues here talking. So let's go. So I alluded to my experience at Yale in the 1980s. And I worked in Yale. There's a thing called Science Hill. The science departments are segregated off, as you might imagine, at Yale. And some of the students, very few of them, walk up that hill during their time period at Yale. And but we would be standing above and kind of laughing, because that was the heyday of deconstructionism in the English departments and several other departments at Yale. And we would scoff at their lack of objective intellectual standards. Based on postmodernism, which was, arguing against the existence of objective knowledge and objective truth, and claiming that all knowledge was tainted by ideological biases due to race, sex, or economic dominance, seeing the entire world in terms of power and oppression at the root of everything, a very Marxist idea. And it was ridiculous. And we said, okay, well, we're up and it'll never happen in science, okay? Now, at the time, you may remember 1996, Alan Sokal, who is also a contributor to this volume, a physicist and mathematician, published a famous paper, the famous spoof paper, in the social science journal, Social Choice. And the title of the paper was Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And it was just gobbledygook. It was just nonsense. But it was nonsense using the verbiage that he found in all of those social journals. Okay, he said, most recently, feminist and post-structuralist critiques have demystified the substantive content of mainstream Western scientific practice, revealing the ideology of domination concealed behind the facade of objectivity. And it goes on, and the scientific community cannot assert a privileged epistemological status with respect to counter-hegemonic narratives emanating from dissident or marginalized communities. Okay? And then it was accepted, and he argued that and he talked about this in terms of quantum gravity and string theory. And then after it was accepted, he pointed out that it made no logical sense whatsoever. And it was on the front page of the New York Times, and it really created a big splash because it was so ridiculous. Now, let's fast forward almost 30 years, okay? The Journal of Chemical Education. Here's an article on a special topics class in chemistry on feminism and science as a tool to disrupt the disconscious racism in STEM. And I'll read this again, because the article presents an argument on the importance of teaching science with a feminist framework and defines it by acknowledging that all knowledge is historically situated and is influenced by social power and politics. Included in the content of the course, this breaks me up, to explore the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism, pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. This is the connection to quantum mechanics, by the way. And to further, if you don't understand the next sentence, no one does. Don't worry about it. To problematize time as a linear social construct, the Copenhagen interpretation of the collapse of the wave function duality was utilized. Well, okay, so you get a sense of the merging of the real and the imaginary with complete, absolute nonsense. The Physical Review, which is a major review in physics, my own field, published an article called Observing Whiteness in Introductory Physics, a case study. I don't have to read the whole thing. One of the things, I think what I've outlined in yellow is important. Entangled with the above is the use of whiteboards as a primary pedagogical tool. They play a role in reconstituting whiteness as a social organization. They collaborate with white organizational culture where ideas and experiences gain value, become more central when written down on whiteboards. Okay, this is, yeah, you're shaking your head. By the way, a counter article was written about this, pointing out all of the problems, and it was rejected by the Physical Review, okay? And it was rejected for the following reason. They used scientific arguments, and they said, well, this isn't a scientific paper, so you can't use scientific arguments to counteract it, which I thought was amusing since it is in the Physical Journal, which is a scientific journal. The National Academy of Sciences down the road awarded one of their highest awards for science communication to a physicist whose writing included an article, Making Black Women Scientists Under White Empiricism, the Racialization of Epistemology in Physics. And this is one of the sentences. Black women must, according to Einstein's principle of covariance, have an equal claim to objectivity regardless of their simultaneously experiencing intersecting axes of oppression. Okay? It's straight out of Alan Sokal. It's straight out of Alan Sokal, and we would have laughed at it in 1996. But now the National Academy of Sciences gave their highest communication award to someone who writes this trash. Okay, political views. It's not just within the context of the academic disciplines. Political views are overwhelming the organizations that govern science. And again, I'll start with physics, but I'll move beyond. The American Physical Society sent out a letter in December 2020 to its membership arguing that Donald Trump's presidential executive order on combating race and sex stereotypes was, quote, in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society. Let me remind you of the order. The order, which was since rescinded by Biden, quoted Martin Luther King stating that in government-supported scientific institutions, people should, quote, not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It argued that materials from places like Argonne National Laboratories that equate color blindness and meritocracy with actions of bias were inappropriate training materials for government-supported science institutions. But what is most shocking is the APS said that these things were antithetical to the values of the American Physical Society, Martin Luther King's statement. That is shocking. But I'll just go through a whole bunch of other quick things to give you a sense. Astrobiology, which is the least scientific of scientific disciplines of late, at a large meeting on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in Pennsylvania, it was decided to forbid using the word intelligence, as it's a white construct. Okay? There was no intelligence at that meeting, clearly, anyway. In the NIH, down the road, my old Francis Collins is an old friend of mine, someone I've known for a while. He was director of the National Institutes of Health. Of course, his star has fallen in recent years. But when he was director, he apologized after George Floyd. He made a public statement apologizing for the existing structural racism in biomedical research and pledged to address the problem with sweeping changes. Now, this is virtue signaling at its best or worst, depending upon how you want to define it. Because if he really believed the biomedical enterprise had systemic racism, and he had been the director for 20 years, he should have resigned. He should have said, I've been the director of a racist institution. So he used the verbiage, but clearly didn't believe it. And there's good reason not to believe it, because there's no evidence that there's systemic racism in biomedical enterprises. There's censorship in hiring. People have talked about this a lot, but you may not be aware, of course, that you should be aware that in many universities they're dominated by a bureaucracy called diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of our people will talk about that. But in particular, those things determined for many years the hiring of people. And this is one of the most egregious examples. The Life Sciences Department at the University of California, Berkeley, reported that it had rejected 76 of its applicants in 2018, 2019, based on their diversity statements without looking at the research records. What happens is these statements by people who could be excellent scientists, they had to write a diversity statement and a research profile. The DEI department would go through their diversity statements and call those that they didn't like. And those include statements that just say things like Martin Luther King would say. People should be judged by the character, not the color of their skin. That's not good enough. And those people be removed before you could see if they were the next great scientists. And that's just obviously disgusting. The National Academy of Sciences, which I love to trash, and deserves it in many cases, here it also jumped in. 1/2 of their membership class in 2021 was women. Isn't that great? Well, let's figure out how it was achieved. A major lever for change has been the Academy's Governing Council. It divides. Most of what the National Academy of Sciences does is determine who its members are and who its members won't be. But anyway, so they have all these governing councils. It divides the new members allocated each year among 6 classes representing 31 disciplines. We assign slots based on the diversity of the lists of nominees that they have forwarded, said their secretary. Classes presenting a more diverse list get extra slots. Oops, sorry. The next year, the council reviews how those slots have been filled and adjusts the distribution based on performance. If the selectors use them to pick a bunch of white guys from Harvard, they get penalized. Okay, so again, the selection process is based not on the quality of the work, but what gender, in this case, people are. And it's selective cancellation of male scientists. And in what is supposed to be the most honorific scientific body in the country, which is supposed to be based on something called merit. Getting near the end, you'll be pleased to know. Gender and prescribed word, well, I'll let Carol talk about some of that, but let me just indicate some other things. Jerry Coyne, who's also one of the co-authors of the journal, wrote an article called "Biology is Not Bigotry." It's a response to "What is a Woman?" It's an article in it was in Free Thought Now. It was removed from the Freedom of Religion website because it does not reflect their values, because it said biology says there are two sexes. Okay, this is secular heresy. It's a secular group, but when you nowadays in secular groups, when you commit heresy, you commit heresy. It's become secular religion. The only difference between secular religion and, say, Christianity is Christianity allows redemption. Okay? The Lancet instructed authors to use the term sex assigned at birth rather than biologic sex. It's a major journal in the UK for medicine. And both Carol and Sally, I'm sure, will say more about some of this. The Australian Department of Health, one of our authors points out, who's from Australia, globally required replacing women with people in all their publications, so that it would come up saying things like 8 in 10 people under 40 will get pregnant within 1 year of trying to have regular sex without contraception. Biologically interesting. Sex in anthropology, or rather the lack of sex in anthropology. And I meant to write Elizabeth Weiss's name on this, but she was on a panel with Carol and others, or going to be on a panel. It was accepted to be presented at the American Anthropological Association entitled, "Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, Why Biological Sex Remains a Necessary Analytic Category for Anthropology." In particular, Elizabeth studies ancient skeletons, and knowing the sex of the skeleton is particularly important when you're trying to determine the roles of individuals in that society. The esteemed leadership of the American Association of Anthropology decided to remove the session, and it reached it in the spirit of respect for our values, the safety and dignity of our members, and the scientific integrity of the program. The ideas were advanced in such a way as to cause harm to members represented by the trans and LGBTQI community of the anthropological community, as well as the community at large. It might offend people to think that ancient skeletons had a sex and that you could determine it without talking to them. Medicine. Well, we'll hear more about it, but I just want to at least point out that in September 2024, 24 U.S. medical and mental health organizations submitted an amicus brief opposing the famous Tennessee law that would limit the availability of gender-affirming medical intervention for minors, something that was approved by the Supreme Court eventually. All these the American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, the American Association of Medical Councils, all of this said, this amicus brief saying, gender-affirming care, including medical interventions for minors, is critical, medically necessary, and evidence-based care for gender dysphoria. As a number of people in our publication, in particular people who aren't here, which is why I mentioned it, Amy Waxman, Roger Cohen, Vernon Gorin, Susan Sullivan, in different ways, have pointed out that every one of those words is wrong. It's neither critical, medically necessary, nor evidence-based. And the real problem is medicine should be evidence-based. The Royal Society of Chemistry, just to point out, this just doesn't happen in associations, but in journals, to give you a sense of the way science has changed. A set of guidelines has been produced by the Royal Society of Chemistry staff to help minimize the risk of publishing inappropriate or otherwise offensive content. This went out to editors. Offense is a subjective matter, and sensitivity to it spans a considerable range. However, we must bear in mind that it's a perception of the recipient that we should consider, regardless of the author's intention. So they indicated they would not publish articles that might offend people, even if they were scientifically valid. It said, please consider whether or not any content, words, depiction, or imagery might have the potential to cause offense, referring to the guidelines. Now, what are the guidelines? What can cause offense? Defined as any content that could reasonably offend someone on the basis of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs, marital or parental status, physical features, national origin, social status, or disability. I mean, there's nothing left. You got to offend somebody. Nature, which used to be an esteemed journal, in Nature Human Behavior, the editor ran a piece saying that science must respect the dignity of rights of all humans. So they decided, basically, and this is the editor's statement, that they would reject articles that might potentially harm, even inadvertently, Groups are groups most vulnerable to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia. So once again, if you write a scientific article that's correct, but it might offend someone, this scientific journal will not publish it. That is extremely worrisome, because that defeats science. It defeats scholarship. It defeats reason. It defeats free inquiry, open discussion, which is central to both science and democracy. And I want to remind, I just want to, as I'm getting near the close here, that this wasn't always this way. They actually were good old days. And you don't have to go back 10 years. Go back to 1710. Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who would, remember, sort of invented the microscope, he did pioneering work in microscopy, and he discovered spermatozoa in semen. And he was concerned that communicating his results in the Royal Society would cause offense. And he wrote to his lordship saying, if this causes offense, don't publish the article. Okay? Back in 1710, the Royal Society decided that offense wasn't important. This was an important discovery. So if only we could go back to the good old days of 1710, we'd be in much, much better shape. When we're living in the bad old days, but they're the modern days. When political and subjective moral goals are imposed on the process and governance of science, even if they're well motivated, they distort and stifle the search for knowledge. Social justice goals are at the root of the problems describing here in this book and in this talks we'll have here. They're well motivated by ideas such as equality, but they do harm because they distort them. And there are many examples of this, and one was related to in the introduction. There are many historical examples from Lysenko in Russia, where genetics was distorted and millions of people starved, and that was the Stalinist campaign against genetics, to the Nazi condemnation of Jewish science. Whenever ideology enters science, it's bad for society, and it's bad for science, and bad for society. So I would end there, but it's important to mention one last thing, because when this book came out, it came out in July, and it's worthwhile pointing out that there is another war on science going on, and the book was written in November, finished in November, and it was before this current attacks going on. But I should say that many of us are concerned by the current attacks that are happening by the current administration on science, and it would be disingenuous of me not to mention that there are such attacks. There are administrations removing leading scientists from government agencies, competent scientists, and is attempting to dismantle universities and departments that don't toe the line. Now, part of this is in response to what I just told you. But what has happened is the assumption is that all of science is woke, all of science is distorted, and instead of treating this with a scalpel and removing the bad stuff, you do great harm if you remove everything. Harvard is a university that has lots of problems, but it's also one of the best research universities in the world. And there were many, many scientists doing great science who just kept their heads below the radar and did science. And I have many colleagues at Harvard, former colleagues of mine, who've had their grants removed for the first time in 40 years doing fundamental research. And it hurts. And the problem is when you remove those grants and you get rid of the postdocs and you get rid of the graduate students and you close the lab, it takes a long time to rebuild. And that's going to hurt. It's happened elsewhere. It happened in Germany in a more extreme way when Jewish scientists were removed, and German universities from Heidelberg to Berlin went from being the best universities in the world to being mediocre within a series of years. This can happen here. Removing support for key scientific projects in my own field, I just listed major ones, cutting the National Science Foundation budget in the proposal by 69% is taking a sledgehammer when you should take a scalpel. I published a paper, I think, in the Wall Street Journal showing that 10% of the NSF budget was DEI related and should have gotten rid of. 10%, yes, not 70%. It's also discouraging students from coming to the United States. And the H-1B thing, of which there's been a lot of discussion lately for industries, you don't also realize that it affects postdoctoral researchers. Many, many people come to this country as postdocs hoping to get an H-1B visa with the intent that maybe they'll become a faculty member later on. They won't have to return to their country. And some of the best faculty members in the country came that way. Well, if you're worried about Silicon Valley being able to afford $100,000 a year for an H-1B visa, you can be certain that Harvard University isn't going to spend $100,000 a year for a good young postdoc from India or China or anywhere. but what I want to point out, and the reason why our book is still relevant, and I have to remind people of this, is unlike the internal war in science, in which the best scientists ignored that internal war, this thing is already decimating the national scientific infrastructure. And it needs to be fought in the legislatures and places where that certainly needs to be fought. But the internal war, which we're discussing, and happily this is my last slide, the internal war is harder to fight, and it may take longer to win. It's already ingrained in bureaucracy, in faculty and students who've been hired under this bureaucracy. It's far from over, and it cannot be forgotten simply because there's an external threat, and it can't be forgotten simply because some things are being done now to counteract it. The future of academia, knowledge, reason, scholarship, technology, physical and economic health of the nation depends on it. And that's why the issues that my colleagues are going to discuss here and that we discuss in the book are important. It's not just for us in academia. Our society depends on a healthy science and academic infrastructure, both for being a vital economic nation and for the health and well-being of the people in it. So that's the overview of what this is about. Now I'm going to introduce my colleagues, and I think Joshua is going to then take over. Is that right?
That's what's going to happen. There's
okay.
not a lot of time, so let's keep it short.
Okay. Well, I won't give you a very
Don't
long
introduce
introduction.
me.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll do it from this side. Okay. Solveig Lucia Gold is a senior fellow in education and society at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. She's a native New Yorker and has a PhD in classics from the University of Cambridge. And prior to joining in her current position, she was a Thomas W. Smith postdoctoral research associate at the James Madison program. She has been interviewed and profiled by every publication you can think of in the country. And she is a co-author with her grandfather, Robert W. Jensen, of Conservations with Poppy, an 8-year-old and her theological grandfather's trade question. She wrote that 3 years ago. Next is Carol Hooven, who is a senior fellow at the AEI and works on free speech and higher education, evidence-based social education on legal policies concerning sex and gender, an issue for which she was publicly canceled for making statements about that, which she'll talk about. She's still an associate in Harvard's Department of Psychology, and she recently received the Hero of Intellectual Freedom Award. It turns out a lot of our members here, I'm quite jealous, have received that award. Sally Sattel, who made the mistake of first inviting me here 20 years ago, is a senior fellow in AEI, and perhaps one of the earliest people to talk about the subject that I'm talking about now. She recognized it at the encroachment of politics in medicine as early as 2000 in her book, PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine. And finally, Joshua Katz, who is a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. For many years was a distinguished professor, the Coates Professor in Humanities and Professor of Classics at Princeton University. He taught there for almost a quarter of a century. He's won many awards, and now he spends his time promoting the best of American culture, fixing our educational system, and advocating for free speech. And he too is whatever it's called, what's the word, the hero? He too is a hero of intellectual freedom. But I must say, not just he, but all the members of the panel are my heroes.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for that introduction, those introductions, and thank you for editing this very important book. It's great to be on stage with some of my very favorite people, and I look forward very much to this conversation. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to have a conversation. I hope it's mostly going to be them and not me talking. We're going to have this conversation for, 40 or 45 minutes, and then I'm going to open the floor up to all of you for questions. In addition to the people in this room, there are a fair number of people watching online. If you're watching online and you have a question, I cannot promise we're going to get to it, but you can always try. If so, send that question to Sean Doolin by email. That's Sean, S-E-A-N, .Doolin, D-O-O-L-A-N, at aei.org. Okay, so here we go. Predictably, and by predictably I mean that I did tell the panelists that this was coming, predictably, I want everybody here briefly to describe the chapters that they wrote. I'm confident that probably nobody in this room has read the book cover to cover, and some of you have probably not even picked it up. AEI, in its largesse, bought a number of copies, and if you're fast enough, you can pick one up for free, and I hope then read it later. But in any case, I'd just like the three people here, other than Lawrence, briefly to tell all of us what it is that they wrote. And let's do it in the order Sally, Carol, Solveig. So Sally, over to you. Social justice, MD, yes. Medicine in trouble or something like that. Medicine under threat.
Yeah, so I am a MD, I'm a psychiatrist. And my chapter is on medicine in the age of social justice, effectively. But, you know, there's certainly no question that medicine, clinical medicine, research medicine, public health, and social spheres overlap. That's not a debate at all. And in the last 30 years, there has been enormous profile of something called the social determinants of health, and that refers to influences like wealth and education, the environment, access to health care, these kinds of things. They're all enormously relevant to the health of individuals and populations. But over the last 10 years or so, another determinant has been added. And that's basically whether one is a membership in an oppressed group and how that affects health. So a lot comes along with this, and I'm focusing, my article chapter was focused on medical schools itself. So I talk about really kind of a universe that most people don't know about. When they think of politicized medicine now or social justice medicine, they will think of the trans debate. And there's an excellent chapter, or maybe more than one in the book, one by Lauren Schwartz. Or they think about you know, all the debate over lockdowns and missing schools in the context of COVID. But I'm talking about a domain that a lot of people don't know about, which is one of the main points and one of the main recommendations of what the hell to do about it, is expose this. So in the name of recognizing or trying to make the healthcare system more fair, and I'm all for that, a lot of damage has been done. For example, now in medical schools, there's an enormous emphasis on the notion that doctors should be social activists and to work on those social determinants that I mentioned. Again, it's one thing to research them and point out the connection between them and health, but changing them, it's very debatable. And in my view, not debatable at all. I think the answer is that doctors shouldn't be involved with broad social issues. So that's one thing that is very strong in medical schools. DEI is a very strong influence in medical schools, and there's a chapter on that by Wax and Cohen. Then there is also the problem of advancing social justice ideology to the point where really starting to obscure open inquiry and scientific rigor. And really that's what the chapter was about. So I know I have like 10 minutes, so I'll be very brief and just giving you an overview of some of these departures, and I would say almost really offenses, to legitimate scientific process. And okay, I'll start with one that's a public health example. A lot of you may remember this, but when the COVID vaccine first was on the horizon in late 2020, you know, it was really an issue of rationing. And there are legitimate ways to ration in medicine. We usually look at what the prognosis of the person is. You know, there's a typical battlefield situation. If someone's going to die, you have to skip over them. You look at who needs help most. That's one model. Another sometimes is lotteries, and another one, a classic one, is like kind of first come, first serve, and that's how we tend to, for example, ration kidneys in the case of kidney transplants. But we don't use reparations and equity to decide who gets a what, and that was exactly what the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the CDC did advise back in November of 2023. Basically, very briefly, the problem was that even though we know that COVID was most dangerous to elderly people, it turned out that demographically, white people were overrepresented in that age group. So we couldn't have that. So basically, there was a decision to give, there's kind of a point system where who gets a hierarchy and distributing the vaccine. Of course, health workers come first, and and people who are delivering, the really front-facing public health people come, workers come first. But then, instead of putting elderly, people over 65 as high on the hierarchy of distribution, it was demoted because, again, I know this may sound almost unbelievable, there were literally too many white people in that category. So the idea was to then give more priority to African Americans. Well, which shouldn't surprise you, and the CDC even did these calculations themselves, that if they followed that protocol, more Black elderly people would die. So the more elderly people would die overall, but also there'd be disproportionate African American deaths. So in the end, this commission did shy away from that, did relinquish that approach. But that is really just an unheard of kind of phenomenon. There have been taboos now in medicine which really infringe on open inquiry. There's a lot of pushback. It's not complete. We still do research on race and genetics in health. It's still being done. But in many cases, there's a fair amount of pushback against that because, after all, race is a social construct, so what kind of practical implications should it have for, let's say, renal disease, which we know happens to be very much influenced by population genetics. In other words, in this case of a certain kind of renal failure, African Americans are just much more susceptible to it. And there's a gene for it, it's been identified, and there are gene therapies being developed right now. That's something you can't afford to overlook. There are gaps in access to health that everyone's heard of, health disparities, they're real. But if you listen to many of my colleagues, you will hear that unequivocally the only explanation for them is systemic racism. Now, I'm not even going to argue that if you connect the dots, several decades back, sure, all kinds of discrimination at the individual and population level has probably been responsible for some setbacks. But you have to look at, right now, you have to consider the fact that what may have caused a problem historically is not what's sustaining it in the present time. And it's those more concrete factors that we should look at. And that's a big debate in medicine because there's a real clamor to look at what so-called upstream factors and how they affect health. Well, doctors don't know how to do that. We don't know how to affect any of those social determinants I mentioned. We can research it, point out, as I said, elucidate the connections, but we don't know how to do anything about it. And doctors I'll close with this. I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to go over time. But doctors have to be very careful to stick with, if they're going to be activists, as we've been exhorted to do by the AMA. I didn't bring one of the quotes, but we have been exhorted now to dismantle racism and fight white supremacy. This is all in the AMA statements and also the American Academy of Pediatrics and so on. If we're going to do these things, we have to, if we're going to be involved in social policy as doctors, not as citizens, but as doctors, we have to do three things. We have to make sure that the kind of policy change or reform we're talking about has a direct influence on patient care, direct influence, like the cuts in Medicaid that are coming potentially. That's very concerning. That's number one. Number two, that we have to have deep expertise, because otherwise we're just basically we're abusing our status as physicians if we say, as a physician, I think we should have, carceral reform or housing policy changes. We're not trained for that. We don't have moral authority, and it's exploiting that. And thirdly, we also have to worry that what we are advocating for doesn't affect the collegiality, our ability to work with our colleagues. There was a very shocking article in the Times last year about how doctors were protesting outside of University of San Francisco Hospital with keffiyehs and screaming "Intifada, Intifada," and the patients heard it in their rooms. I mean, you can't, that's an extreme example. There are more subtle ones in the piece, but you can't afford to alienate patients to medicine is already suffering a lot of public distrust at this time, and we can't afford to inflame it. So I realize I've spoken about things that are quite alarming. I could go on, but it's something we have to know about.
Great. Carol was already brought up by Lawrence. Her chapter is Why I Left Harvard. Carol.
Thank you. So you guys all did such a great job of setting me up here. And so my chapter is Why I Left Harvard. And that was started in 2021. And technically, I resigned under pressure, under duress, I should say, in early 2023. And the reason that I've been so nicely set up is because Tony talked about norms, and what I really want to focus on is not exactly what happened to me, but the conditions that support what happened to me. And I'm going to argue that those conditions still exist on campus and are totally antithetical to the mission of the university. I'll probably start crying at some point. I feel very passionately about this, and I'm sad about what's going on. And that mission is about truth. And that should be the highest value and the highest priority. Knowledge seeking, knowledge production, and dissemination. And that's what I was really into. I was passionate about it. I was good at it. I loved it. It gave me a lot of meaning and purpose in my life. And I don't have that anymore. And yes, I'm pissed. So I'm not hesitant, shall we say, to criticize what's going on at Harvard today, which a lot of people don't like, which I understand because it is not flattering, but also, as Lawrence detailed, the universities, in particular Harvard, are under a tremendous amount of pressure from the federal administration. And I think there are some interesting questions there about what it would take for the university on its own to make the substantive changes that are necessary to solve some of the very real problems that still exist. But there's a conflict there, of course, because there's a lot that's given up in that process. Am I still on here? I feel like my mic is off.
I can hear you.
Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to start, since everyone, I think, understands what's happening in terms of what's coming from the Trump administration to Harvard, I want to start with a letter from Alan Garber, the current Harvard president, which was in response to a letter from Linda McMahon, the education secretary. So he wrote, and I think this was in May, Harvard is a place to bring people of all backgrounds together to learn in an inclusive environment. This is this year, May of this year. Together in an inclusive environment where ideas flourish regardless of whether they are deemed conservative, liberal, or something else. A place where assumptions and claims are tested and challenged respectfully and thoughtfully in pursuit of knowledge and truth. And in many quarters of Harvard, that is happening. But in too many quarters, it is not happening. And I say this because, and I'm going to use a very recent example that I wrote about, I think it was published last week in Tablet magazine they called it There Are Two Gametes, although that was not the point of the essay. It was about not being able to say that there are two gametes or having that particular scientific view polluted, morally polluted, and how that then can affect campus culture in ways that tend to squash viewpoint diversity and increase feelings of a need to censor on campus. And that's what I'm concerned about and hope that we can fix. So I want to start with an anecdote that I talked about in that article, and I want you to, so I live in Cambridge, Mass. I am a Democrat, but I have a view that is not trendy in my neighborhood, as far as I can tell. It's not trendy at Harvard. I mean, a lot of the scientists share the view, but many are afraid to sort of say it very explicitly, especially in public, especially when it might be associated with any particular kind of public policy. So just imagine you're a professor just hired at Harvard, you're from the South maybe, you voted for Trump. And in your neighborhood, there were signs all over the place, MAGA signs. You move into Cambridge, you buy your $3-4 million house, you go to your first block party, somebody raises their glass and makes a land acknowledgement. And you raise your glass, right? You don't really believe in land acknowledgements, but what are you going to do? You're meeting all these people for the first time, and all the signs in the yards around you, what do they say? In this house, we believe. What do we believe in? Good liberal values. Science is science. Love is love. Nobody's illegal, right? So you are getting the cultural signals about what you're supposed to believe. Somebody then starts complaining about, immigration on the southern border, and you just start nodding along. That's completely understandable. We are social creatures. We want to be accepted by our tribe. That's sort of an automatic response, and it's easy to fall into it. This is exactly what should not be happening on university campuses. And I want you to imagine that that is exactly what is happening in too many quarters. And what we need is to combat those signs that people are getting in so many different ways. And I'm going to tell you about this one example of this. But there needs to be an active and vigorous championing of the habits that cultivate civil discourse on campus. And right now, I think that is really lacking. And there's the signs are that there are certain views that you're supposed to hold if you want to be a good person and accepted by the tribe, and if you don't want to lose your reputation and your dignity, which happened to me. I lost pretty much everything in terms of my career and my dignity, reputation, salary. So I started my PhD at Harvard in '99. I had done research out in Uganda on wild chimps, and ended up getting my PhD at Harvard in '04. And I stayed on as a non-tenured instructor, essentially, and co-director of undergraduate studies in human evolutionary biology. I published a book called T, The Story of Testosterone, the Hormone That Dominates and Divides Us. I went on Fox News, and I said there are two sexes. There's male and female. They're based on gamete size. I can talk about that later if anyone's interested. But this is the consensus view of evolutionary biologists. The director of our department's DEI task force, who happened to be a graduate student, represented herself in that capacity, speaking on behalf of Harvard. She took to Twitter, called my views transphobic and harmful. And this is the key, is that I was causing harm. My views were harmful to vulnerable populations, therefore I was bad. My view is bad, my view is toxic, and therefore the science is bad. That science needs to change if we're going to support the right views so that view supports a particular political outcome. And I was not having that. I did not apologize. I was eventually unable to teach my class and ended up leaving, and it was miserable. So the reason I stood up for science is because it matters. It's important. Truth matters. Facts matter. You can imagine why it matters, no matter what your politics are, that we have a definition based in fact of sex in law, that we understand something about the reality of sex for medicine, for anybody on whatever side of the issue you're on, about bathrooms or sports. I think, sure, I'm a Democrat, but sure, people who watch Fox News should have access to those facts, even if we disagree about the particular policy, if there are any policy implications. So I think I just have 3 more minutes, and I just want to tell you what I read in The Lancet, I think about maybe a little over a month ago. There was a review in the medical journal The Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, a review of a book so this is from a Harvard professor, wrote the review, a gender studies scholar, And she wrote a review of a book by a Princeton professor called Sex is a Spectrum. Evolutionary biologists, for the most part, if they're mainstream, do not understand how that could possibly be true, but it is a narrative that's gained a lot of steam in today's political climate. And here's what she wrote. Here's just part of what she wrote in this review. She started off complaining about Trump and how Trump is attacking the rights of gender minorities. And so it's in that context. Yet there were still these sentences in the review. So the two-sex idea that biologists hold is sometimes called the gametic definition based on gamete size. Men make sperm, males make sperm across animals, and females make eggs, basically. So here's the quote. Although the gametic definition makes reference to biological systems, it is sophistry, not science. Those who promote this definition favor the assertion that sex inheres in gamete, sperm and egg production, because in part, it facilitates their political aims by fueling unhinged panic in some quarters about transgender threats to traditional gender roles, like the scientific bigots of yore. And then she gives an example of a scientific bigot of yore, this guy, J. McGregor Allen. The recent favor bestowed on the gametic definition of sex by anti-trans traditionalists appeals selectively to science to naturalize and rationalize inequality and exclusion. She goes on to praise the author, the Princeton author of this Sex is a Spectrum book, for recognizing scientists' responsibility, quote, responsibility to respond to harmful deployments of inaccurate, overly simplistic, and reductionist science by those attempting to naturalize and depoliticize their hateful views. This just happened. So the culture, there's something about the culture at places like Harvard that is not quite working to combat what we really need to be combating. Everybody has not gotten the message here. And that's all right. People are allowed to express their views. But I don't see evidence. I'm still at Harvard in Steve Pinker's lab, in a sense. I have an unpaid position. But I know what is going on. And I haven't seen evidence of real change on campus. There may be, but this is still happening. And this is the way that the neighborhood signals are transmitted. This person who wrote the article is the head of a big gender studies lab. This stuff gets out into the world, it spreads on campus, and now a certain view is toxic, and censorship, self-censorship increases. And that matters, and it's all about the culture. It's not necessarily about the policies or the initiatives or committees. We have to figure out how to create and support and maintain a culture where the top value is not protecting people from offense. The top value is truth. End of story.
Great. And Solveig, a paper that she, in fact, wrote with me, An Apology for Philology.
I am his wife. No one has said that, but yes, we did write this chapter together.
That's why we're separated at a great distance on
Far
stage.
away
Far
as
ends.
possible, yeah. So what is a chapter about classics doing in a volume on science? It's a fair question, though, as Lawrence himself nicely points out in the introduction to the book, much of science as we know it would not exist without the ancient civilizations studied by classicists. And I think we can also at this point acknowledge that it's important for scientists to pay attention to what happens in the humanities because, as Lawrence mentioned today, while scientists used to scoff at deconstructionism in humanities departments, they're not scoffing now. Many of the same ideological forces that have been undermining the humanities for decades are now overtaking the sciences. Still, what makes classics a particularly relevant case study in the war on science is that for a long time, classics was actually the holdout, the lone discipline in the humanities largely uncorrupted by ideological trends. It's really only since Trump's election in 2016 that classics has fallen prey to radical progressivism, putting it on roughly the same timeline as the hard sciences discussed in the volume. And it's not a coincidence that classics and the hard sciences have been on a similar timeline, because what classics and the sciences, as they have traditionally been practiced, have in common is an attention to evidence. Classics is, or was, a data-driven discipline. Our data just happen to be words, Greek and Latin words. Now, the word science comes, of course, from Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, or as Merriam-Webster defines scientia, especially knowledge based on demonstrable and reproducible data. Here's the takeaway. The war on science is at its heart a war on scientia, a war on data-driven knowledge. And classics is an important front in that war. Our chapter begins with the Princeton Classics Department's now infamous decision in 2021 to eliminate its language requirement for undergraduate majors so that students could graduate with a degree in classics without ever taking a single course in Greek or Latin. To put this into perspective, this is roughly the equivalent of a physics department no longer requiring its majors to know any calculus. The languages are the basis from which any and all study of antiquity necessarily begins. And in an interdisciplinary field like classics, the languages are also the one thing holding the different parts of the department together. But as Joshua and I explain, the languages have recently been pushed aside, in large part because the core method of classics has been pushed aside, the core method known as classical philology. What is classical philology? It is a quasi-scientific approach to reading texts, the attempt to understand a text as it was produced in its historical context with as few anachronistic preconceptions as possible. The classical philologist unpacks each word or phrase by comparing it with other uses of the word or phrase in a given author's corpus, and in the broader corpus of text to which that author would have been exposed. In short, philology pays close attention to data, words, in an effort to achieve objective truth. Who could possibly object to philology, you ask? A number of prominent classicists who have in recent years published a series of widely cited articles attacking the method. Their criticisms of philology pretty much overnight became gospel in our field, and so Joshua and I set out to read them for ourselves. This was taxing work. The arguments are jargon-heavy and difficult to parse. But it was rewarding work, too, because we were able to prove just how flimsy the attacks on philology really are. This is the bulk of our chapter, An Apology for Philology. I'll give you the spark notes. There are 3 charges against philology. First, that philology was historically associated with slaveholders, imperialism, and race science. For instance, the founder of the American Journal of Philology was a slaveholder and fought for the Confederacy. As we write, this charge is undeniable, but not all that remarkable. Every long-standing field of inquiry has been shaped by people with reprehensible views, many of them involved in reprehensible practices. Those views and practices do not necessarily implicate the inquiry. Schrödinger was a pedophile, but that has no bearing on his cat. Moreover, even if classical philology had been explicitly engineered to be a means of supporting, say, slavery, it was not, the philological method would not necessarily be compromised. But the second charge against philology is that the philological method is necessarily compromised. It is intrinsically white. Here's a representative quote from University of Chicago professor Patrice Rankin. Representing the Oedipal secret of your identity, which is hidden in plain sight, it might never occur to you that your ability to read and write about Euripides, unimpeded by anything but the text, manuscripts, and your outstanding philological training, owes to your racial identity, your whiteness. In other words, white scholars are so accustomed to a culture of whiteness that we do not realize how whiteness colors everything we do, including how we read ancient texts. We may think we have developed an impartial, near-scientific method of textual interpretation, but really, philology is a means of blindly projecting our contemporary white biases onto the past under the guise of objectivity. As Joshua and I write, this is not a critique of philology, it is a critique of bad philology. Good philology forces us to acknowledge precisely those contemporary biases that Rankin seems to believe it actively conceals. A good philologist knows that when she reads just about any word in Greek or Latin, she will project onto the word a whole host of meanings and references that have accumulated around the word in the past 2,000 years. Her task, the task of a philologist, is to strip away those meanings and get to the meaning of the word as it was originally written. Now, is it actually possible to strip away all those meanings? Possible to fully unrace ourselves? According to the naysayers, it is not, and Joshua and I actually agree with them. It probably is impossible to strip away all our biases. But that does not mean we should throw in the towel, give up trying to understand the ancients on their own terms, and resign ourselves to identity-driven studies. Impartiality, however unattainable, remains a worthy goal. And crucially, not one of these scholars has ever provided evidence that the impossibility of fully unracing ourselves actually does have a significant impact on philological scholarship. Where are all these white supremacist misreadings of Euripides? The naysayers never give an example. Or rather, they do give two examples, just two, neither from philological scholarship. And as Joshua and I had great fun exposing in our chapter, these examples amount to absolutely nothing. The one example is a classicist's attempt at anthropology, not philology, and the other involves a wild misrepresentation of its source in what is a staggering act of either intellectual sloppiness or dishonesty. If you're interested, we can talk more about that later. The key thing, though, is that in classics, as in the sciences, there is no data to support the attacks on data-driven inquiry. And yet, a thoroughly unsubstantiated idea gets repeated again and again, mindlessly cited in footnote after footnote until people believe it must be true. Lawrence writes about the shocking disregard scientists have for the lack of any evidence to support claims that say the discipline of physics is shaped by systemic racism. Scientists are supposed to care about proving this kind of causation. Likewise, classicists are supposed to care about the footnotes. And this brings us to the final charge against philology, that because it is associated with ideas like merit, rigor, and excellence, it has been weaponized to dismiss other approaches to classics. As Joshua and I write in response, we are apologists for philology, but we do not believe that philology is the only worthy way to do classics. We would, however, like to see excellence across the board. I'll close then with our picture of academic excellence. Excellence means maintaining high standards in both language instruction and scholarship. Students should be competent in Greek and Latin, and scholars at all levels should be expected to marshal correctly cited evidence creatively to make valid and ideally also sound arguments in a comprehensible way. This comprehensibility matters precisely because it is what makes the scholarship accessible to non-specialists. That is to say, what makes it not exclusionary or elitist. Still, no, not everyone can do it. Excellence necessarily excludes. This is true in classics, it's true in physics, it's true of every field worth studying, that is, of any kind of scientia. Thank you.
So with such eloquence on stage, the moderator has the impossible task of, asking a dozen questions now in something like 7 minutes and getting responses. So that's, of course, not going to happen. But let me combine and hope for some quick answers here, two sort of obvious questions. And they have to do with how we got here and where we're going. So Carol, you briefly mentioned that you started out in Uganda, and you didn't tell us much about how you got to where you are, except in recent years, but you did point out that things at the moment don't seem to be getting better. So maybe let me push you aside for just 1 minute and ask Sally and then Solveig about what it was like when you got into the field and what you think is going to happen next. So when you started your MD, did you think medicine was a great thing? Did you think any of this was going to happen? And what do you think is going to happen next? Would you recommend that people go to med school? And Solveig, I mean, you are demonstrably a generation younger than the other people on stage. You said it all started in 2016, but you, of course, then went to graduate school after it started. So what's your perspective of this? Sally?
I would definitely recommend people go to medical school to dilute, the climate that is so prevalent now. I mean, people who want to put patient care over politics, it's not so hard. People who don't necessarily want to become research scientists, but who have an appreciation of the scientific process. And also, I think I do wish, there are a handful of doctors around the country. The most prominent is Jeffrey Flyer, who was the former dean of Harvard School of Medicine, who are, be more outspoken And as I think you mentioned, Carol, or something, you really need to embolden so many of your colleagues who are, terrified of speaking up. I mean, we have lost, I think, I mean, I can't quantify it. I wish someone could. We've really lost a fair amount of expertise in my field because so much of medical education, especially in the clinical years, is almost discretionary. Like you're a senior oncologist, and you could spend more time in your lab, you could spend more time in the clinic, but you could also spend time teaching. But if you live in fear you're going to step on a microaggressive landmine, a lot of doctors have pulled back from this kind of teaching. And that is an enormous loss of educational prowess. I mean, these people are seasoned and they're sophisticated. And that's terrible. But so, the more we could try to tap into what I still think is a general rejection of this. There is an age gradient. I know the younger doctors find what I've talked about, the themes that I elicited, much more amenable. There's a lot of data showing that the politics of doctors has gone far left. There's also, as most people have read about, a lot of burnout among physicians, and I think that leads to a sense of resignation and passivity. And when you're in the midst of people who are politicized and energized, there's a tendency to say, all right, knock yourself out. But that's not healthy. There's another dimension that's very controversial, but the field is very feminized now, and there is a psychology, and this has been Zach Goldberg, many other people have documented the kinds of values that are tend to find concentrated in women academics, a lot of justice sensitivity, which is a wonderful thing, but not when it's not basically when it manifests as, for example, getting your patient to vote. I mean, this is something that now was happening last election season, that doctors were encouraged to try to get their patients to vote. That this is a realm in which these kinds of political commitments just have no role. They, as I said, lose credibility for us. They siphon off the time and energy we need to put in patient care. They really hurt our credibility. And also, finally, if we want to lobby about really important things that have direct impact on patients, they really alienate politicians. They just look at us and say, well, you're just, a bunch of lefties. Or this whole situation, I'd have as much contempt if you're just a bunch of, right-wing nuts. But that's just not, the climate now. But.
Solveig, fast.
Right.
Sorry.
So yes, I did choose to go to graduate school in classics in the middle of all of this craziness happening in the field. It was not yet apparent quite how crazy it was going to be, and I chose to go to graduate school in the UK in part because the UK actually seemed somewhat immune to all of this. I like to say that at least when I was there, the UK was 10 years behind the US on most of this stuff, except actually the trans issue where they were probably 10 years ahead of us. But the Cambridge Classics department was the ultimate ivory tower for my time there. I like to say that it's always après moi le déluge. I left Princeton, everything fell apart. I left Cambridge, now it's starting to fall apart too. Causation, correlation, I don't know, Lawrence, you can tell me. But yeah, I also married a Princeton classicist thinking that I was gonna have a nice, comfortable life as a faculty wife, a tenured professor, but things changed very, very quickly in our department, more than anyone could have anticipated. That said, things are changing quickly again now. With the the renaissance happening with all these civic centers around America and major state universities, there's suddenly actually a pipeline issue. We need more classicists. We need more people trained in intellectual history and those kinds of issues in the humanities. And so actually where before you might have said, no, if you're remotely conservative or even just traditional and studying the classics, stay far away from graduate school, now the advice looks a little different and you think, well, maybe actually you should go to graduate school.
I'm gonna ask one more question, at least, maybe just one. So Sally, you're Ivy League educated, your chapter begins with Yale, you still have an appointment at Yale. Lawrence, you're a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, you taught at Yale. Carol, you have a PhD from Harvard. You were at Harvard. Your chapter is about Harvard. Solveig, your chapter and my chapter begins with Princeton. You just mentioned Princeton. Oh yeah, Carol, you mentioned a Princeton professor, Augustine Fuentes. So the names Yale, Princeton, and Harvard are very dominant up here. Is this accidental? Is this an elite problem? If up on stage right now were people not from H, Y, and P and the like, would this look different? How does this work, Carol?
Yes, it would. So Rob Henderson, if anyone knows who that is, has I think he originated the concept of luxury values. So I think there are a lot of privileged, basically wealthy elites who make up these college university campuses. And I think this is typical of people who often hold sort of extreme progressive values where they can champion certain views that are actually don't really affect them personally, but might be perceived as quite harmful for people who are not part of that demographic. So I think it would be different. And I just want to say, can I just say one other
Please.
thing that I didn't say? That the reason why viewpoint diversity is so important to truth, I think everyone must know this, but we need to have our ideas challenged. We have to talk to people who disagree with us. And that is the way, when you're challenged, especially by experts, throughout your academic career, you fine-tune your views and we work together, and that's why universities are so important. And when we're not doing that on the university, and when we're signaling to the public that the best thing to do is to kind of subtly signal that the other side should close their mouths, it results in political extremism. And I think that these universities that we all represent have in some important ways contributed to that broader cultural, extremely serious issue. And so that's part of why I'm trying not to give up hope, and I am going after Harvard. It's not just because I'm angry, it's because I think it's incredibly important that we change the culture on campuses.
That all sounds right to me. I was going to say that classics, of course, faces a unique issue at universities that have less money than the Ivies, because classics is often on the chopping block. It's one of the first departments to get cut. We're seeing that even at the University of Chicago right now, which you wouldn't think would be a place that would cut classics, but it is. So the ideological issues are true across the board, whether you're looking at the Ivies or somewhere else, but the funding issues are obviously different than other places.
I just did a little survey, since I believe empiricism is important. Of the authors in the book, the majority of them are not associated with Ivy League universities, or were not educated at them, which I think, and some of them teach at liberal arts colleges as well. There was obviously method in that when I chose people. But I think what's important is, because Ivy League universities are Ivy League, if one of the authors, here's a Chapman, Colorado State, let's say, if we talked, it's just the way it is in the world, that if you said, look, Colorado State's got problems, they're going to say, that's okay, because Colorado State, who cares about Colorado State or Chapman University or whatever. And so pointing out that the problems are so pervasive that even the institutions that you think of as the guardians of scholarship and reason have been polluted is important. I think that's a really important thing to say. Now, I'm also going to do something that you didn't ask, but just 1 minute, because I took notes when each of our colleagues who were speaking, and I knew they'd be self-deprecating and not say. So I have one or two comments on each of your things that I think you didn't say, but you could have said, and should have. Sally, by the way, Sally has, in my opinion, the best line in the book, which is, the best way to be an anti-racist doctor is to be a good doctor.
Okay. That's the final sentence of her chapter.
Yeah, final sentence, and she didn't say it. I was hoping she would, but she didn't, but I love it. I should also say that what she's talking about is not just implicit, it's explicit, and you could read her article. But one of the things in the introduction, I now live in Canada, is that Canadian Medical Association has specifically said in medical education that social justice concerns should be more important than medical knowledge in the training of doctors. Okay, so that's one thing I want to say. Carol, well, Carol talked a little bit about her problems. And by the way, Harvard not only has these problems, it has documented problems of discriminating against Asian applicants and all sorts of other discrimination problems. But the thing that I don't think she emphasized enough, she talked about the attack that came from, yes, some offended student who then created a social media uproar and the standard things that happen. But what allows that to happen, and the real problem, is the lack of background among administrators. Carol's administrators, several of whom were quite sympathetic with her, were either reluctant or openly failed to defend her and defend academic freedom because they knew that, well, there are many reasons, but one of them is that their own careers might be on the line. They could have, privately they supported, publicly they didn't. And that's one of the huge problems of academia, because many faculty don't buy into this nonsense, but the leaders of academia who used to be intellectual leaders are now fundraisers full-time, who don't care, who would look and say, in the short term, what's more important for me? Defending academic scholarship, defending free speech, or getting rid of this person because, yeah, it's bad for them, but in the long run, the optics are better for us because I don't want to have a social justice mob on me. And until those people get backbone, there's going to be a problem. And she suffered from that directly. Finally, Solveig, what she didn't say, which I think is important, it's implicit in what she said, in the Princeton decision to remove the requirements of learning Greek and Latin, what that obviously is racist. Because you don't remove it unless you think certain people can't do Greek and Latin, right? And so this whole concern about racism in philology is just obviated by the action of removing a discipline because you think it's too difficult for certain people, certain races, genders, or whatever, to study. And she didn't say it, but it's clearly a racist decision. And the final thing I want to say is I object strongly to the idea that Solveig is demonstrably younger than the rest of the people.
Oh no, I need Botox.
I'm just going to add one comment to what Lauren said. I was hoping you were going to point out that the contributors to the book have a variety of educational backgrounds and institutional affiliations. They also come from a number of countries.
Yeah.
This is the American Enterprise Institute. We have been concentrating here on the United States, but in fact, there is a fair amount of internationalism, especially if you include Canada in this volume, and an abridged, sadly abridged, but still, an abridged version of this volume came out just last week in the UK. Okay.
And there'll be an event the day after tomorrow that I'll be at in London with only the British people, except for Amy Wax, who happens to be in town that day. Okay, sorry.
Amy is definitely not British.
Yeah.
Right. So there is time for one or two quick questions and answers. Sir.
So, putting aside anything that's happened this last year, you suddenly become president of the United States. You have 4 years to fix this problem, maybe 2 before the other party gets control of half of Congress. What do you do?
You don't do, in my opinion, what the current administration is doing. I mean, certain things, I wrote a Washington, WSJ piece on one of his first executive orders, which was anti-DEI. That, I think, was a good decision. But what you don't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. What you do is you attack the real problems, and you don't assume because the patient exhibits certain problems that they're dead or their entire organism is gone. I think what you try and do is you don't create two wrongs, don't create a right. So you can't say I'm going to fight intolerance in scholarship by requiring people not to say this. Okay, you can't, and that's what's happening, unfortunately. I think you have to stand where you believe you stand. You have to be in favor of free speech. You have to try and attack areas where the free speech is being attacked, but you don't do it by imposing your own ideology because the next people are going to impose their ideology. So I think that's part of the problem in my view. I'm not going to give you the solution because if I had it, I wouldn't be running. But anyway.
Anybody else want to take that one on?
Well, you and I have been working a little bit on some of these issues. One of our solutions, this is a small one, but in the humanities, we would like to see accreditors only accrediting universities where every department actually has a prescribed curriculum for its undergraduates. In the sciences, this is usually how things go. A physics major has to take calculus and certain aspects of physics. But in any humanities department in the Ivy League, there is not going to be a single, well, with some exceptions, there's not going to be a single.
Very minor exceptions.
Very minor exceptions. There's no curriculum. You cannot assume that an English major from any Ivy League humanities, from any Ivy League university has read any particular book. You cannot assume that a history major has studied any particular period, not even American history. There's just no curriculum, no particular classes that anyone has to take. Now, we do not want to see outside influences dictating what those classes are. We do believe in academic freedom, but we would like to see the restoration of actual curricula of the kind you have in the sciences. Obviously, the curricula has not made sciences immune from the craziness, but it has helped, and in the humanities, we have none of that.
It's worth pointing out that it not only it's happening in the sciences too, and in fact,
Right.
again, in my country, Canada, there was, a government-sponsored program called Decolonizing Science,
Yeah.
which argued that physics was too difficult and shouldn't be taught as it was, because it's just too difficult for indigenous people to get idea, and so therefore physics, we shouldn't use math and little things like that. So that kind of nonsense is pervading the science as well.
Sally
I was
wants
just
to
going
talk.
to say, just really, enforce the Supreme Court decision about affirmative action. It's a medical school is too late in the pipeline to be compensating for all the sadly, tragically bad training, bad education that folks are getting, kids are getting. There are all kinds of things, obvious socially, to do to compensate for strengthen, enhance earlier education, but that's not the point at which to do it. And I know that DEI is going underground.
And it's not the point more broadly in education. You don't solve, there are problems of inequities in this country. You don't solve them at the highest level of tenured professors. It just does, it's ridiculous because, first of all, the candidates are already, independent of their gender or race, or have already gone to good schools and everything. If you want to solve the problem, you have to solve the problem where it is, not at the last level of the hierarchy.
One last question, Daniel.
Thank you. This is a question for Sally and Carol. And the question is there an opportunity to use the professional communities that exist outside the academy for these fields to bring more sensible, kind of a return to normalcy and sensibility within the academy? I realize that classics, most classicists that are doing classics for a living are probably working in the proximity of the academy, if not within it. But most doctors, most scientists, I would presume, are working outside of the academy in industry or in practice. And is there any, I don't know whether it's a renegade association or any potential to use professional communities in those fields to improve the situations you're describing?
So I can just say something quickly about that. First, yes, there are professional associations. Most of them, I would say, are something like captured also. So there's many people in those associations who say disagree with the treatment of gender dysphoric use, maybe even the majority, but they are obviously afraid to express their views because they want to hold on to their reputations and careers. That may be changing. But so I think there are some issues. Yes, there should be an opportunity, but I don't know how realistic that is. I do want to say that a lot of universities now, including Harvard, and I'm very active in Harvard's Council on Academic Freedom, and I think that this council, Jeff Flyer and Steve Pinker, for instance, are co-presidents, has had a really significant influence on some substantive changes at Harvard, like removing mandatory DEI statements for new faculty hires, instituting a institutional neutrality policy because of pressure from within that organization. There is a problem in that, like, for instance, I'm a Democrat, but I'm very pro-academic freedom and fighting for that. They tend to be perceived as conservatives, so don't necessarily have a lot of buy-in. But I think there are things we can do, but overall, I'm not unfortunately super optimistic, but I like your idea, and maybe more renegade associations will crop up. There are some scientists who are willing to speak out. A lot of them are at the end of their careers, like Richard Dawkins. Even Steve Pinker is starting to do that more. Not that he's at the end of his career. He just published a great new book that's a bestseller. Anyway.
Sally, 30 seconds.
Okay, accreditation is one thing that's going on a little bit more, and I didn't even talk about what's going on in the psychotherapy world, the teaching of therapy, the Counseling Association. There may be a parallel organization started. In medicine, it's very hard to have parallel institutions. You can't just start a medical. I mean, you can, but it's much. You can imagine just the money and the facilities. That's just a very hard thing to do. So I want Jeff Flyer to talk out a lot more and embolden his colleagues. And then there's a group called Do No Harm. In fact, the president of it will be here on October 28th, talking about his book. And they are really taking the legal route primarily, which is suing over DEI offices, suing about statements, what's it called? Statements of, well, basically.
Diversity statements?
Thank you, yes, that kind of thing. And that's another strategy. And of course, in the world of gender medicine, I think that suing. I think the lawsuit route, if malpractice, some young, we're talking kids, of course, who never went through what should be just a given. It's malpractice not to do a good psychological, lengthy, extensive psychological examination of kids who are confused or adamant, confused about their gender, or adamant they're in the wrong body. It's complicated. I don't feel it's never actually indicated. I guess I'm a little squishy on that one. I think there may be some circumstances, but to not do the proper kind of examination and is just criminal or civil in this case. So.
Well, I wish we had another hour, but we don't. Thank you all for coming. If you still have not picked up a book and you can get it before other people do, please do. Please, if you pick it up, actually read it and talk about it and, I don't know, tweet about it, do that sort of thing. But to all of the panelists, thanks very much. Yes.